You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Josh Williams. Josh is the host of Welldagum, a podcast where guests share funny and enlightening personal stories, and more recently, Podbless, where he and his guest hosts explore the intersection between faith and everyday life. Today, we are going to talk about podcasts, Christianity, his life experiences, and much more. Josh, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Nice to be here.
And you're actually live and in person. This is only the third time I've ever done a live show, so it's good to have you, hanging out in my wife's office with me this morning.
Yeah, I'm glad I took my weekly shower.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So tell us about yourself, your background, and your podcasts.
Okay, well, my name's Josh Williams. I'm from Eastern Kentucky. I moved up to the Northern Kentucky area, greater Cincinnati area, probably 10 years ago, almost, and went from being a coal miner to a stay-at-home dad. So I grew up in church all my life, though, in the Eastern Kentucky area, so very... I don't know what you would say there. Very, very conservative. But I grew up in the Nazarene church, and I was more so called Nazicostal. My mom was very into the Pentecostal movement and very charismatic, and so I got to experience both sides of that, which the Nazarene church there was pretty charismatic back in the day. We would hear people, we would be in the basement of the church and hear people running and shouting and having a big old time. And so I was really accustomed to that and very used to that. So from there, I ended up going to Bible college at Kentucky Mountain Bible College, very small place in Breathitt County, Kentucky. And spent a few years there, traveled for them, sang in their choir, did drama team for them, recruiting, whatnot. And got kicked out for breaking rules and then telling on myself. So otherwise I wouldn't have been kicked out, I guess, but I was honest and tried to do the right thing.
Well, and again, I mean, I went to a Christian college as well, and some of the rules that they have at those places are absolutely ridiculous. Like, we had to sign a contract. I went to Cincinnati Christian University, which doesn't exist anymore, and I think a lot of it has to do with the rule. But it was like we were all over the age of 18, and we weren't allowed to smoke while we were there, even if we were over age. You couldn't drink even if you're over 21. They said we couldn't watch rated R movies. I mean, just ridiculous. And everyone broke the rules, but we all signed the contract. So
we had a contract too, and ours were way more harsh. I know we had a lot of affiliates with Cincinnati Christian, Asbury, things of that nature. And but at my little Bible college, there wasn't TVs in the dorm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Honestly, there wasn't central air and heat either when I first started.
Man.
Yeah, and we were on the third floor in the attic space. So it was a lot of interesting stories to be told there. But yeah, it was very strict the same way, and that was a lot of the reason. I took it way more serious than I should have. I really felt a call to go there. I wasn't going to go to college. I was a dum-dum. I barely skated by. I had like a 2.4 GPA, I think, when I graduated. And I was just like, how can I have this low of a GPA and still be considered a graduate? And so I really wasn't going to do anything with my life. I thought about going to tech school, becoming a diesel mechanic, something of that nature. And then that summer I graduated, 2001. God really put a pull on my heart and spoke to me. It was the first time I'd ever heard a voice and spoke in my ear and said, you need to go to Kentucky Mountain Bible College. Furthest thing from my mind. I spent all summer asking him if he wanted to do something with me, send me to the mission field, be a martyr or whatever. Right. And he said, go to college. And I was like, oh, come on. Why did you pull the hardest one? So yeah, that's what I ended up doing. Through that, I traveled to Africa on mission trips. I, like I said, traveled for the school recruiting, became a youth minister. I was a youth minister before without all the credentials. A volunteer. So I did that for a long time. And then I did it after I left. I still found my redemption. I didn't take that and just be like, well, I'm a heathen.
Right.
So I did the youth work and things of that there in Turkey Creek, Church of the Nazarene. I worked in Blanchester, Ohio for a short time on an internship. And then started, like I said, I was working different jobs, started working in the coal mines, and decided it was time for a change. I think I worked for a utility company before I moved to Northern Kentucky. So I worked for the water company for 6 years, and it was just a rut, digging my own holes,
Yeah, literally a rut.
Yeah, it was good. I had a lot of wandering experiences, I guess you'd say. Partied and stuff like that. Got really far away from God. And then when I came up here, it was me rededicating and trying to make a difference. And I worked for Indiana Wesleyan through our mutual friend Matt. He hooked me up with that. And as soon as I moved up here, 2 weeks of moving up to Northern Kentucky, I met my now wife at a Super Bowl party, actually.
Okay, all right. So you're coming up on the anniversary.
Anniversary, that's right. Went to Pastor Dave's house, our pastor, and was just hanging out. Had never met her. Had known her family for years through the district stuff with church camp and things, and walked up and she was like, "So I hear a lot about your name, Josh." And I said, "Yeah." And she has a brother at the time was in high school, like 17 years younger, 16 years younger. And she said, "Yeah, my little brother tells me I need to marry you." And I was like,
"Wow,
okay." And at the time, she was out of med school and was moving into the infectious disease field. She was going through that process.
So not only is she a great lady, but she's a doctor too.
Yeah.
So, real smart, and it was great.
Well, that was the funniest part is when I moved up, everyone was like, "You need to meet my cousin. You need to meet my sister. You need to meet this girl I know that's single." Because I was around 30 years old.
Yeah.
And so everyone was trying to hook me up with this person and that person, and no one, absolutely no one was saying, "You should meet Dr. Kelly." Right. Because they were like, she's out of his league. But yeah, she walked up, introduced herself, and we made a few jokes, laughing around with some of her family members and the church people and things. And then later that evening, I did like a true teenager, even though I wasn't one, and messaged her on Facebook.
Nice.
And said,
nice.
"Hey, you want to go get a bite of food later this week?" And of course, being a doctor, she was like, "I don't have time for that." And she ended up getting off early on that Wednesday. We went out to La Rosa's, had some pizza, and I put my foot in my mouth every chance I had. That should have never happened. It would have been ruined from every red flag was thrown by me. And she eventually was just like, "You know what? He's a really nice guy." And so we just kept pushing through it. We had a couple of rocky spots, and eventually 6 months in, I proposed and was like, "I'm not waiting around."
Yeah.
So yeah, we 6 months later after that, we got married, and now we got 3 kids later. And like I said, I'm a stay-at-home dad now. I quit the workforce, and very happily so. And I guess past that, started doing a podcast after I quit the workforce, doing it as a hobby.
Yeah.
Trying to do that, and was like, I got very interested in listening to the podcasts when I was working doing night shift.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of mindless stuff going on. And so just having that stuff pumping through my head, listening constantly. And it got me very interested to be like, I really want to share stories and do something. So I took about a year of studying other podcasts, trying to figure out the right equipment, and working that direction. And eventually, after working with some guys, dementia is a big thing in our family.
Yeah.
And my dad died from it. My grandpa, his dad, died from it. My mom's mom died from it. Let's see, my great-grandma died. It's a big history of dementia in our family. And when I went to my dad's funeral, sorry, I'm really rambling on.
Oh no, dude, you're perfect. You're perfect. You're perfect.
We can cut what we do.
No, I love it. I'm just making sure we're still recording.
Okay,
we're good, dude. We're good.
But after my dad died, that was the big one, I guess. I went to the funeral, and he was a coal miner all of his life. My brother was a coal miner, uncles were coal miners, and all of these coal miners would come up to me that I've never met and was like, "Your dad saved my life." I said, "What?" Like, what are you talking about? He never has mentioned this. And they would be like, "Yeah, there was a fire underground, and I was trying to stop the fire and ended up passing out because I wasn't following the rules. And he would crawl under the smoke, grab me, drag me back, come down and get some air, go back up, grab me." And there was like countless stories of people coming up and just being like,
"That's awesome.
Yeah, like I would have gotten fired if it wasn't for your dad, or he saved my life, or he did this." And I'm just like, I've never heard any of these stories, and now they're gone.
Right.
And so that wanted me to spur on to try, as long as the internet is a real thing, to put something out there that can share people's fun stories. Not necessarily having to be groundbreaking, earth-shattering stories. Some are. But I love spreading laughter. That's all my whole gig. And that's how I started the Welldagum podcast. Welldagum.
Which is a great introduction, by the way. And you have the perfect voice for that intro. It's great.
I appreciate it. I need to get back on it. It's been a long time of making that show, and I've not put one out in quite a bit. But it is a fun show that I still have the rights to. So
yeah. Well, and one of the cool things too, I guess we should, make this a disclaimer to the listeners, is that we go to the same church, and so we've known each other for a long time. And Dr. Matthew Barber, that we talked about just a couple minutes ago, he was on, I think, episode 10 of the show talking about Christian schools. He is one of our good friends too. Yeah. And so like early on in Welldagum, you were just literally like taking friends that you knew, bringing them on and having them share some of their funny stories. What was the selection process for you? Like, how did you go about choosing who was going to come on your show and what they were going to talk about?
Well, like I said, it never started off with groundbreaking stuff. Nothing very heartfelt.
Right.
And so I would just talk to people that were interested in podcasting as well, but not pulling the trigger just yet. And so I would say, what's the funniest thing you remember about your past? And they would be like, well, there was this one time such and such happened. And I was like, well, let's talk about that. So for 45 minutes to an hour, that's what we did. We just sat down, hashed it out. I started off wanting to make 2 episodes a week. One of the podcasts I followed did that, where they put out like a 30-minute episode twice a week. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. Very overwhelming. Don't try doing more than once a week.
Yeah. I like sticking it to a once a week schedule is like the best. And every now and then you can release a special episode, and people are happy about that. But yeah, one a week is a lot.
Oh yeah. So that got shot in the head pretty quick. Because I would have a guest share a couple of stories, try to bank them and put them out. Anyway, but yeah, just mostly wanting people to share a funny story. And started off with a mutual friend of Josh Anderson. He shared of a time of wrecking a truck. He shared of a time of almost pooping his pants. Yeah. That was a funny one. Those are good go-tos. Yep. People really enjoy the poop my pants stories. But that was pretty much it. I've always been a talker, and so I've always been able to pull stuff out of people. So there was not a ton of planning except for getting someone in the studio and just being like, okay, let's talk, and pushing them towards that. And so even if it's someone who doesn't like to talk a lot, I was able to, I don't know, I'm very neutral, and so I don't cause a lot of controversy. And so I always try to be uplifting, and that gets people feeling good, and they just start talking. And luckily, I'm recording.
Yeah. And you've had some really great conversations. Were there any from the Welldagum podcast that stand out to you in particular? Like, what were some of your favorite stories that were shared on your show?
Like we were saying with Dr. Barber, our mutual friend, I always enjoyed having him on because he was always a go-to that wanted to help me. If I was in a rut, couldn't get someone on, he would always show up. So there was a time he shared of Ubering. So he used to Uber a lot.
Yeah, he did. I forgot about that.
He used to Uber a lot, and one of his stories we called Famous Amos because he picked up a guy who didn't really call for the Uber. Someone else called for the Uber for him, and he shows up to this crack house hotel and was like, hey, Amos? And he goes, yep, that's me. Just call me Amos. And Matt's like, all right, call me Matt. I guess I'll give you my real name. And he just kept telling Matt he wanted to find drugs. And Matt was like, I'm in a tight spot here. So he kept trying to drive around like, oh, yeah, probably over here. And so he was trying not to cause him to act out. And the guy looked like he just got off a bender anyway. And it was a crazy story of ups and downs. If you want to listen to it,
yeah,
go to the backlogs. But yeah, that was one of my favorites. I've had my mother on actually sharing about having polio as a little kid.
Yeah.
That was a fun episode. Well, not fun, but interesting to share those real stories. I've done several episodes through the pandemic with my wife, answering questions from viewers or listeners. And I feel like that was a lot of fun. But like I said, meeting new people and having them share funny stories or embarrassing stories about themselves, all of those, I don't think I've had but maybe 2 episodes that I was kind of like, I wish I hadn't done that.
Right.
Or I've had a couple episodes I lost that were really amazing.
Oh, that sucks.
That sucks. There was Rob Adamson had a really awesome episode we did that I messed up recording, and then a friend of mine, Brandon Moore, shared one, and we both talked about it afterwards, and we're like, we can't share that episode.
Right. Just it was too much. Yeah.
Too much information. Super hilarious, but too much information. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your current podcast is called Podbless, and you have a couple of guest hosts. So talk to us about Podbless and what's like the goal of that show, because I think this is one that's going to be really interesting for a lot of listeners of this show,
right?
Because you guys have a lot of conversations that overlap with some of the themes that we talk about here. So just talk about Podbless a little bit.
Okay. Well, Podbless was going to start before I started Welldagum. Pastor Joey Butch is, I don't know if you've got to meet him yet.
I don't think I have.
We'll have to get him hooked up with you.
Yeah.
But he's a pastor of a Nazarene church in the local area, and I've known him through youth ministry. He was a youth pastor for years, and we were discussing starting a podcast when I started Welldagum, because he wanted to do it, I wanted to do it, and nothing ever happened. And so we planned and we let it fall behind, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it by myself. And that's when that podcast child started, her little baby. So eventually, after 2 years, he brought it up and was like, oh, hey, I think I'm going to start a podcast. I was like, yeah, like we talked about 2 years ago. And he was like, huh? He'd totally forgotten that we had discussed it and talked about it. And I was like, yeah, that's the reason I started mine, because we didn't do the one we were going to do. So he was like, well, yeah, let's do it. And so him and I sat in his office at the church as the youth pastor, and just pitched the ideas. I locked down the name of Podbless, thinking of like God bless, a long time, at that time, actually, 2 years prior. So I said, like, I still have this name. Let's get the Twitter down. Let's get the social medias all locked in. And we just sat down and started talking. We didn't have a lot of crazy thoughts about it. We didn't have the whole plan fully out. But we're like, let's talk about our walk in Christ. Let's talk about the silly things that have happened, being both him, a current youth pastor, and me, a prior youth pastor. And topics started splurging. Each one of us bring a topic now of like, I'll usually be silly, but sometimes I'll bring a serious subject of like, hey, let's talk about what's happening in the news right now. Or, hey, let's talk about how the pandemic came to be in our Christian walk. Like what happened to us when we were locked into a place alone. Or like, but mostly silly. Like I like to be silly. But at the end of every show, we try to do a segment where we find a dumb news clip and we'll pod bless somebody's heart. And, like, because God bless your heart is an insult
right
in the Kentucky area. So we'll do that every episode. We'll have a pod bless segment. And then it's grown from there. Our friend Brett Dickman, who's actually a relative of mine now through marriage, he was always there. He's our side guy who always has some kind of little segment of food or talking about sports. That's his thing. Yeah. But we've grown. We've started doing live video. We went from just audio to live video, and we're currently trying to make short clip videos, trying to do all the stuff that you're supposed to do for social media, and it's just not our wheelhouse. So it's a fun growing experience.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and it's really hard to do that kind of stuff too. Like I think a lot of people that are listening to this show, they consume a lot of podcasts, but I don't think they understand how much work goes into it, especially if you're not paying like a professional production team to do all of your because there are a lot of people that have a podcast, especially if you have name recognition or if you're like an author or someone who's been out there in the media. They have people that they literally record it, they send the recordings to somebody else, or they have a producer that does the record. All they do is sit down and talk, and some tech guy does all the work for them. But just being self-produced like you guys, like it takes a lot of effort.
Oh yeah. We started off with some cheap stuff. I know when Joey he'd bought all this stuff, and I was like, you should have talked to me. Like I've been doing podcasts for 2 years, and he was like, oh yeah, what do you think I should do? So he ended up sending back everything he bought. And I was like, well, this is the equipment we need. Rode from Australia, the company Rode, they make all kinds of awesome equipment. So we ended up securing a lot of that stuff and just investing into it early on. And over time, we've been buying little cameras, putting a little money into this, a little money into that. We've still not made any money from the show. And that was something we're actually holding off on, because it's like, when we get into that, there's 3 of us. It's a weird thing.
Right, yeah.
Like, who's going to hold the bank account? Like, how are we going to do this? So we're getting closer to that idea of things, having monetization and all that. But, we're constantly growing, doing it all ourselves, like you said. Yeah. I would love to pay somebody
right. Oh,
to
man,
do all that extra. But yeah, if you listen to the show, you hear that we do it ourselves.
Yeah, but it sounds a lot cleaner. I mean, because again, we were talking about this a little bit before the show, but there are a lot of people that start podcasts, and I think I read a statistic that the average podcast only lasts like 8 episodes, and a lot of those, like, you can tell that these guys are talking into the microphone on their computer, and it just sounds. I think you guys sound great compared to kind of like the median podcast. So I really like that.
Yeah,
you guys all have a background in ministry.
Correct.
How does that shape the perspective that you guys bring to the show? Because it is like an openly Christian podcast, just like the Protestant Libertarian podcast is an openly Christian podcast. Talk about how that background just impacts the interactions that you guys have with each other and the content that you bring to your listeners.
It's fun. Joey is currently a senior pastor of the church he's at. We're not affiliated with his church, but of course we all have a background from that area. Brett is a volunteer at the church. His wife is the children's pastor, so he's always there helping out, volunteering. So him and Joey have this dynamic. I am kind of a retired youth worker, a retired children's worker. I used to volunteer a ton at our church, and since the pandemic and stuff, I've pulled back, and the kids getting older, it takes a lot for me with 3 kids. And, even though I see moms at our church do it, and I'm just like, how do they do this?
Right. Yeah. I mean, but you are essentially, as the father of 3, I mean, you're a daycare worker literally all the time. So like I'm sure it's nice to go to church sometimes and drop your kids off and just go sit in the sanctuary with your wife without any kids for 45 minutes. Like that, it's a good feeling to do that.
Yeah. I feel like I'm cheating on something or doing something wrong when I do that. But so yeah, I have that background in a sense, but now I consider myself the ne'er-do-well or I don't want to say heretic, but I feel of myself as the bad boy of the group in a way, because I don't affiliate with any of that stuff, and I don't feel that. I guess that was always a struggle for me. Was Bible college? I had to keep my hair cut a certain way. Like we had serious rules.
That's even. I thought we had it bad at CCU. No, you guys had it
always pants, no shorts ever allowed, no cut off t-shirts. We did get to wear short sleeve shirts. It was a pretty neat thing. Damn. So I've always been under a strict rule. And so getting into this, I was really wanting to pull myself away to be like, okay, I'm not under anybody's wing. I'm not got to worry about what I say except for me.
Right.
And so every once in a while, I'll try to rock the boat as far as the Christian stuff goes. But we have a good dynamic. I feel that we all come from a lot of the same background. We have some disagreements here and there as far as how we think about things. But there's a lot of strong opinions, so that always makes it fun.
Yeah.
Joey will share things. Being a pastor, he's always looking for a sermon anyway, so he'll share some things that almost sounds like a sermon. I was like, "Are you going to preach on that on Sunday?" And he goes, "Maybe not this Sunday."
Yeah, but he's working his ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I was in ministry too. When you prepare for a lesson, like, you find yourself thinking about it all week long. Like in my personal Bible study, or like my personal like Bible reading, I would read through the passages that I was going to teach on, and then you just found that you would work that content into every conversation that you had. You got to practice your material before you get up there on the stage and preach it.
Oh yeah, especially when it's fresh in your brain. You're like, I'm going to talk about this. This will sound good, and people will be like, "Oh wow, he really knows what he's talking about this week."
Yes, that's right. And then by the time you get to the following Sunday, you've forgotten everything that you talked about the week before because you've been so focused on whatever it is you're going to present that week.
Yeah. So, those pastors that pull things up from the memory banks, I'm just like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
that was last week.
But I really do think that there are a lot of pastors that I know that essentially have like a 3 or 4 year preaching cycle, and so they keep, it's not a filing cabinet anymore, but like a hard drive, and so it's almost like lectionary. You get to the end of the 3rd or 4th year, and you're like, well, we're going back to the beginning. You're just going to pull all the old material.
Yeah, but I run off a lot of old congregation. I can do the old stuff again.
Right. Yeah. Yep. But it is. I mean, preaching a sermon is a lot like doing a podcast. It takes a lot more work than people think. Like a lot of people, you go to church on Sunday, your pastor gets up there and he talks for 25-30 minutes, and everyone thinks that it's natural for him to do that, but it takes a lot of preparation if you want to do it the right way. People don't really understand what goes into that.
We try to stay away from any kind of scripted stuff too much. We have a recorded intro that we just play before the show starts that we just recently changed that up. It used to say, "I'm Josh, I'm Joey, blah 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 blah." Now we've changed it up to be shorter. I was like, we've been at it 108 109 episodes I think, and I said, we've been at it so long that I feel like people know who we are. If they come here, they get it, that we don't have to tell them who we are. Let's just put a bunch of fun clips together. We took all the funny things we could remember, put it into a clip, and that's just some music and a clip of that. So we try to, just to play off each other really well. And there's a good dynamic between Joey and I. Brett always has something funny and quippy to say. and it's just a bunch of dad jokes and trying to keep it clean.
Yeah. No, and you guys do a really good job of that. One of the interesting things about the show is that you guys do occasionally have like theological and political disagreements. Yeah. And I remember very distinctly, because I was on a trip when I listened to this episode back in October. You guys had a debate on your show about drug legalization, and I know that there was like, and I forget who it was, but someone took the stance on the show that like all drugs should be legalized, and someone else was like, well, there would be societal harm. You guys had a really interesting back and forth about that on the show. Yeah. So what are some of the biggest theological and political disagreements that the three of you guys have? and not that I want to start a war with your co-host on the show, but you guys have a really interesting way of having conversations about those.
I feel like I'm the devil's advocate when it comes to a lot of that, as far as being just being the bad guy. Or I like to think of myself that way, I guess. But Joey, being a senior pastor, he takes some hard stances as far as like, going by the doctrine of the Nazarene Church.
And you really have to when you're in that position. And regardless of what you feel on the inside, the problem is when you represent a church that belongs to a particular denomination, like you have to toe the line to a certain extent. And that's just the way the game gets played in ministry, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so he takes those hard stances, and I already get those hard stances. I know that. I grew up in the church, and like I said, the Bible college experience was even more hardcore when it came to that idea. So for me, I've not experienced hard drug use, and I've not dabbled too deeply into it. I did in the past a slight bit, but no heroin or anything. Yeah. Right. But I do. I don't know. I guess listening to some of your episodes as well, looking at the government and how things were structured, and hate being labeled a conspiracy theorist. But so many of these things I feel have merit.
Right. Yeah.
And so kind of shaking the boat, or even when it comes to the church, shaking the boat a bit like, I'm trying to think of how to word that properly without putting my foot in my mouth. But rocking the boat on rules that don't have a lot of meaning to them, or that are just a tradition.
Right. Asking hard questions about like arbitrary authority.
Like it's just some of those things we just follow because we do. Yeah. How we were raised, or just it doesn't change anything too much, so we just go along with it. I'm good about going along with a lot of stuff, so it's out of character for me to rock that boat. But when I'm around people that have to follow certain rules, it's fun to poke the bear.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that is one of, like you were saying before, one of the greatest things about leaving ministry. Because I was in ministry for 8 years. Yeah. And during that time, I did a lot of reading and a lot of studying, and I started to come to some theological conclusions that were I wouldn't call them progressive, but that were definitely outside of what many people might consider the traditional perspective on some of those issues. And it's just so nice to be able to step outside of that world. Yeah. And voice those opinions without having to worry about whether or not somebody in the church is going to be offended by it. Yeah. And so it does give you more of an opportunity to explore issues that you might be locked into when you're a pastor in ministry. And again, like a lot of pastors, I think, are a lot more open theologically than they can admit from the pulpit on Sunday, but they have to worry about the spiritual health of their congregation. Yeah. And you can't be, if you're in that position, too controversial because you don't want to push people away. There's that give and take between wanting to express the truth as you see it, but also making sure that you're pulling people along in a way that appeals to them without like deliberately shocking or offending them.
Yeah, I try not to be negative. And like you said, coming from ministry, my wife was never in ministry. She traveled with Doctors Without Borders. She rubs it in my face. She's been to the Amazon. She's been to Africa, all this different stuff. I think she did a 3-month stint of working in Africa with her med degree. But I have to try to not be negative. But I always laugh if I hear our pastor or someone who's speaking use a symbolism in a way of like, well, when I walked outside, it was raining, but I want God to rain on you. Right, those silly things. Right. Those are good. They tug at people's hearts, and it makes them feel like, oh yeah, I get that. That makes sense to think of God that way. But for me, coming from the ministry, preaching tons of sermons, whatever, I just laugh every single time. Right. I get it, and that makes people feel good. But I have to constantly check myself to not tell my wife like, oh, that was pretty funny. And she's like, what do you mean funny? That was heartfelt, and it changed my life. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I meant.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Once you've seen behind the curtain a little bit, you kind of know how it works. And that's another thing too, like with preaching. And I know I don't want to, our pastor Dave, I think he's a great speaker and a great preacher, but I know that I've talked to him before, and you've experienced this. I've experienced this.
Yeah.
When you're preaching in a congregation, every congregation is diverse. So you're going to have people that have very little education. You're going to have people like, there are a lot of people that go to our church that have doctorates, some work in academia and medicine, like your wife and things like that. And so it is very, very difficult as a preacher to appeal to all of those groups of people. And then you have like Christians that have only been Christians for a little while, or maybe they like, you have like a husband who is kind of on the fence about their faith, and they come with their wife because it's what she requires him to do in order to maintain a happy marriage. And then you have people that have been faithfully serving their church for 30, 40, 50 years. So it's really hard as a preacher to find that sweet spot where you can appeal to everybody. And so for those of us that have been in ministry, it's hard sometimes not to be cynical about like, and again, I think our pastor does a great job of appealing to absolutely everyone. And usually I walk away like thinking about something that he said during the sermon.
I mean, there's a reason we go there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that there are at our church, there are a lot of like ministry refugees. There are a lot of ex-ministry people in our church.
Tons.
Yeah. And so but it's easy to be cynical about the whole system once you've stepped outside of it. One of the things that I appreciate about Podbless is that you guys do a very good job of appealing to a wide audience, but also like you said, you play the devil's advocate, and you can kind of push some of the issues a little bit further than if all three of you are still like locked into ministry in a particular church.
Yeah, it really put me in that spot that I always wanted to be in, I think, of like, I was always bound, like you said, I was always bound by the rules before. And so every time I would get a new job, even with Indiana Wesleyan, they have guidelines that they want you to go by as well. So I left all that stuff and being a coal miner and rough and tough and doing whatever, or out in the field with a water company. And then I go back to a place that's like, I got to cut my hair good again. I've got to make sure I'm clean kept and like wearing dress clothes. Like, oh man, I can't get away from this. So yeah, it feels good to be in that spot of just kind of being my own person and figuring things out on my own, as opposed to, I don't know. I grew up in a home where my mother was very, she was my go-to. Hey, what am I supposed to think about this? And she's like, oh, well, this is what we believe. Okay. And I would just go along with it as a kid. Oh, hey, I'm 18 now. I got to go vote. What? Just go do all Republican. I was like, are you sure? Yeah. Just hit the Republican tab and just you'll be fine. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then getting older and realizing like, oh, I can have an opinion. I don't have to do this because everybody does this. And getting into your whole libertarian idea, or not idea, but thought process and things. I've got a few friends that are really into the libertarian movement, and we discuss it here and there, and we talk about it a little bit and stuff. But it's really encouraging. I'm still on the card as a Republican, but I don't think of myself that way at all. Yeah, like it's one of those things. I guess I'm in a hard spot of like not wanting to vote anymore, and like feeling like everything just lets me down when it comes to governmental stuff anymore.
Right. Which is a completely rational position to hold.
Yeah. It's like,
it's apathetic.
How can my vote even matter? They've got it rigged.
They do.
It doesn't matter if I actually vote for someone I want to see, because unless we have a giant movement of people coming in and being like, everybody do this. Right. Oh, okay, let's all do this.
Right.
So they don't know we're doing it. Let's just do this. But sorry, that was going down another path.
That was great. that was great. Well, I do think, like, to your point, I have this theory that the majority of people that don't learn to think for themselves either embrace every political and theological position that their parents have, or they directly repudiate it. Yeah. So that's the thing. So like people go to college and they wind up either reinforcing all the beliefs that they previously had, or they absolutely reject them and do the exact opposite of what their parents did. And both of those positions lack any sort of intellectual nuance. Like there's no sort of like, I'm trying to figure these things out for themselves, and I'm on the process of trying to discover to a greater and greater degree what the truth actually is. Yeah. It's just, there are these ideas out here. I'm going to accept them for either I was always raised this way, or I want to be a contrarian and go against whatever way I was raised.
There's a lot of views that way I have now, just having time to sit around by myself and not have a doctrine pushing me a certain way. And there's so many things that I come up with that I don't bring up to a lot of people, because in getting in that thought process of like, okay, I'm just going to break the stigma of believing what I'm supposed to believe and be like, wait a minute, like, why is this the only Bible? Why is this the chosen scripture? Like, like they made that the Bible years and years and years ago. What's to say there's not a new Bible that someone was supposed to write and didn't, or did write, and it's just like, no, we're using this one.
Right.
King James Version, that's the right one.
Right.
You know, like, because I grew up in places that, or I traveled for the Bible college, and I would go to camps and they're like, bring your King James Bible because they'll kick you out if you have something else.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, are you for real?
Yeah.
And they would be like, well, the King James is right. And I was like, that was just like repurposed in poetry for King James himself. And they don't like to get in those discussions. So I tend to push away from it. But in my head, I still think of that all the time of like, oh, well, God told me something once. What's to say over these thousands and thousands of years or whatever the number really is, why didn't he tell somebody else something?
Right.
Like, why are we still doing this one thing when, is it so we stay conformatory and stay stay following the things we're supposed to? So
well, and I think we should be able to be in a position as Christians where we ask those hard questions. And I've always felt that when people are unwilling to criticize the positions that they hold, it's because they're insecure about the truth of their ideas. Because if you are confident, and if you're confident that your beliefs are true, then you don't need to worry about the scrutiny that will come from those, because the arguments for your beliefs will stand for themselves. Like no one can assail that. So you can be confident and you can engage in dialogue and debate with people that don't hold your positions. And one of the things that I found, especially when I went to college and started studying the Bible historically, a lot of the assumptions that I had about the Bible when I was younger were just absolutely wrong. Like they were based on a flawed set of premises about what the Bible was and what it was supposed to do. But as I studied it historically, I wound up actually coming to a deeper appreciation of the reliability of Scripture, even though the way that I approached it was fundamentally different than what I had been taught to believe. And I think that asking those difficult questions and trying to come up with a more rational, intellectual, and empirical basis for our faith actually strengthens it. It doesn't hurt it at all. And that does mean that you have to change some of your beliefs. Like a lot of my theological positions have changed over the last 15 or 20 years. Like I don't believe in the same things that I did when I was in high school now as an adult. But then that's also, I think, the sign of a maturing faith as well, because I think that there is this problem within evangelical Christianity where it's like the problem of systematic theology. So you have a guy that writes like an 800-page book, and he outlines all of these different doctrines, and he says, this is it. This explains absolutely everything. And once you get locked into that, it means that God cannot speak to you anymore. It means that the Bible can't challenge your beliefs anymore.
Right.
It's like, and what we are saying in essence when we do that is that we have arrived at the truth, that we as finite created human beings have apprehended everything that we need to know about an infinite and transcendent God. And I just think that that's impossible. Yeah. And it's like very arrogant and almost blasphemous for us to say as Christians, oh, we've got it all figured out. We're gonna write this 800-page systematic theology. We're gonna say our creeds, and that's all we need to know. And that's the truth right there. And I think life is just a lot more complicated than that.
I was actually listening since I was driving over anyway to your house. I was listening to your last episode, and I was listening to you guys talk about leadership and things of that nature. But that's all that kept resounding in my head was that we're all just a bunch of babies.
Yeah.
We always put someone in charge of something. I was like, why do we always have to have someone in charge? Why is there always one person has to be in charge of everything we do? Church, government, Chipotle. Right. There's a manager that's in control of everybody. Why do we always have to put someone in charge? Because we're all just a bunch of babies figuring it out.
Right.
And what's to say that the one person figures it out because they talk better than us? Right. No, I mean, I get it. We have to have some structure, but we're all just a bunch of people trying to figure it out. And that comes with parenthood too.
Right.
Realizing that our parents weren't our role models. Right. They were just the ones in charge of us.
Right.
And you look at your kids and you're like, I'm just figuring this stuff out.
Right. Yeah.
Why? Hey, Ben, this morning even. Ben, get out of the bathtub. Why? Because I said so.
Right.
That's not a good reason. I was like, it is because I'm your father and I'm in charge of you and we have things to do. But why? And I'm like, man, you're sick. Stop.
Yeah.
Don't start this stuff now because I know as a teenager it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
But and I guess that's my growing process right now is just remembering when somebody has a strong opinion or yells or gets mad at someone, wants to fight with someone. We're just big babies.
Right.
And he's figuring it out. He's got stuff going on.
Right.
This guy had a bad morning. He's had a bad night's sleep. He's not taking care of himself. That's why he wants to fight with someone.
Right.
It's not a real thing that needs to happen. We're not going to be in a utopian society, but, just realizing that everyone's a giant baby really helps you get through life a little bit easier.
Right. Yeah. And again, like we're all products of the environment in which we were raised. And so we have our social and cultural biases, and it's impossible for us to completely eliminate those. And I think that we have kind of tended to view knowledge in the Western world as objective. Like there's just knowledge out there to be discovered. And if we use reason and if we use the scientific method, we can come to an absolute understanding of all of reality. But it's really impossible to get outside of our biases. And I think the only way that you can have the intellectual humility to do that is to acknowledge that your mind is limited and that our minds are not capable of processing the whole of reality, and being open to exploring new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. And I think that it is really hard for a lot of people to do because they want to, well, like, I feel like as human beings, we feel the need to be like the masters of our own destiny, and we feel this need to be able to control and understand everything that happens in the universe. But the older and older I get, the more I realize we don't really have control of any of it, which is a scary thought. But then it's also freeing to know that I don't have to have all of the right answers about everything, and that's like it's okay. Like life is a process of growth and evolution, and then it also opens you up to having authentic relationships with people that don't think like you or vote like you or believe the same way that you do, because you understand that they're on that process as well. You know?
Yeah, that was something I figured out with Welldagum podcast, was having someone on every episode. So many of the people that I would have on know me from the past, and they knew me as youth pastor Josh or youth worker Josh. I would show up at camp and everybody's like, oh, good, Josh is here. We're going to have a wiffle ball game. You know, like it's going to be fun. And so I would have so many of those on, but I didn't want it to be a Christian podcast. I wanted people to come on and be who they were. I didn't want them to have to put themselves down into a little box of like, well, I can't do this. Like, no, you can do whatever you want. Talk, cuss, talk about weird stuff, whatever you want to do. And so many people that would come on would be like, well, so-and-so told me I got to be clean. And I was like, no, that was them. They knew me and they were doing it out of respect. I was like, but I'm nobody. Just come on and be who you want to be. Say what you really want to say. And that's when you end up with a lot of the good stuff, is when people just let loose and are like, I'm just going to actually be me and not be concerned with rules and regulations.
Right. And that's the same thing that I've tried to do on my show as well. Because I always feel like if I'm going to invite a guest on, it's a free speech show. So you can do and say whatever you want to do. It's really easy for me to hit the expletive button, on the podcast stream. And it's not a problem. And then, if you want to listen to my show and you have your kids in the car, you wait until your kids aren't in the car to listen to it. But I think it's really important to have all of that perspective and to allow people to talk. And like on my show, I've had several episodes where I've had people on that aren't libertarians or that aren't even Christians. But they come on because that we agree on an issue. And I think that they have a really great nuanced perspective on something that I don't have. And I want to learn from that person and have them on. And I think those kinds of conversations are so much more productive. So we had an episode about, about 15 episodes ago, where I had on 3 guests. Ray McGovern's one of the big ones. He's like an anti-war activist. And then it was Jennifer Calthor and Christina, I'm going to butcher their last names, but I have to go back and look at the show notes. But they were really great guests, and all 3 of them were progressives, like very, very, very progressive. But they had just an excellent take on war, and they understood the history of like the CIA's torture program in a way that I didn't. And so having them on the show and having them explain it was great. But then also like being able to hear how somebody who is a progressive processes the exact same problem that I see with like the military-industrial complex and the warfare state was really eye-opening to me, because it's like, these are people that their worldview is radically different than mine. Just like one of them was an atheist, one of them was a Methodist minister, and one of them was like an ecumenical Catholic. So really wide theological perspective, all kind of progressive. But it was just amazing to hear how they approached that track from a position that was completely different than my own. And it was also amazing to me like how much we had in common. Like at the end of the show, I'm like, okay, like this is like a really important issue, and I'm glad that we like agree on this really important issue. A lot of the other things we might disagree with are not as significant as what we're talking about on the show right now. Yeah,
and being raised in the church and stuff like that, so many things feel that way. So many things feel that you can't have those discussions, or you can't hang out with those types of people. And I guess that was the scripture we always relied on, was, God hung out with the tax collectors, the people that people hated, and the prostitutes and whatnot. And I remember doing that a lot. I would always reach out to the kids that nobody wanted to sit with at the table, or I would always reach out to, that was kind of my thing back in the day, was like, I want to challenge myself with these kids because I grew up in rural, or like out in the sticks, Kentucky. And so my kids from my youth group wouldn't hang out with other kids from the district, or like when we would get together for camps and stuff. And I was so perplexed by that. I'm like, that's why we're here. We're not here to hang out with each other. We're here to experience other people.
Right, absolutely.
And so the goth table, there'd be all these kids like in makeup and black all over and dreads and just hanging out over there. And they were like, I'm not going over there. That's terrifying. I was like, why is it terrifying? They're here too, just like you. And I would go sit with them and talk to them. And there was even some kids that went to Bible college afterwards, or like Mount Vernon Nazarene University. And they were like, they would hit me up and like, can I use you in a sermon? I'm like, wait, why? And they're like, the love of Jesus you showed back in the day, like that was something that really helped mold a lot of my experience. And I was just like, wow, it worked.
Yeah.
Like me just trying to be me and learn myself, it rubbed off on people and put a positive aspect, as opposed to, well, that made me say that I'm going to be a Nazarene through and through. They never said that.
Right.
They saw the love, just me showing love.
Right.
And so...
And I think that's what really draws people to Christianity. Like, there are very few people that become Christians because someone blows them over with an intellectual argument. Because a lot of people that aren't a part of the church don't really know anything about theology or church history or doctrine or any of that. So, and then they know very little about the Bible as well. What really matters for them is seeing the love of Jesus in somebody's life and it working out in an authentic way. And I think it's like you said, when I was in high school, my theology was all kinds of messed up, and I had a very rules-based approach to God. But I knew that like I had a responsibility to love and accept other people where they were at, in the same way that God loved and accepted me where I was at. And so like you, like the friend group that I had when I was at school was like just this crazy mix of kids from all different backgrounds. But I learned a lot by being their friends, and a lot of them came from like broken homes, and I didn't when I was growing up. So it was not cool because it's really sad, but like it was great to be able to have that perspective and build relationships with those people. It shaped the way that I thought about why other people might not live the same life that I live, and it opened the door up for some really interesting conversations with those people. And I think that it's just great for us as Christians to be able to step outside of our world. And even for a lot of Christians, it might not even be stepping outside of Christianity. It might just be stepping outside of your denomination or your tradition, and like having conversations with Christians that come from other traditions. It's a really eye-opening and important experience.
Yeah. Okay, this is funny, but like going back to as a kid like that, living that life and doing that same kind of concept, being around people you weren't supposed to be around. I've been propositioned to buy, like people trying to buy drugs from me because they think I'm a drug dealer or they thought that I was on drugs. And I'm just be like, no, no, I don't do any of that. But they would just look at me like, oh, come on. Yeah. give me some Xanax. And I'm like, no, dude, I don't do drugs. But that was like my kind of life of, I didn't do those things, and I was super hardcore. Yeah. Like I wouldn't kiss girls or do chew or go with girls who do all that silly nonsense that's from back in the day. But yeah, it was good to have that experience of being around others that weren't the same as me. I always loved that concept of learning. I've never been a super intellectual, like digging into books and things of that nature. That was what was scary about coming on here, because I know you are an intellectual person, and I always was the dumb kid growing up, and so it was always like intimidating to be around people that were super learned, like Dr. Barber and things. I always joked about that and how I don't know. I just always felt out of place in that scenario, but I did always want to learn. But I learned not from books, but from experiences. Right.
Well, and I think that's a lot more important than just learning from books. And one of the problems that I have, and I mean, I'm a public school teacher too, and I have a lot of problems with the public education system. And one of my biggest problems, the hobby horse that I've been on for a while now, is that like our public schools do not instill a love for learning in students. Yeah. It's about rote memorization. It's about learning to read and write and do math so that you can pass the state standardized test at the end of the year. And so I feel like there are a lot of kids like there are a lot of kids that were in the position that you were growing up who are actually naturally very intelligent, but that just don't fit into that format that they push on kids at the public schools. And they do it not because they want kids to have a well-rounded education. They do it because they want kids to pass the standardized test so that they can make money for their school district from the federal government and from the state. So it's all like this Ponzi scheme. And they wind up labeling all of these kids that have like great intelligence that might not fit into the format that the public schools want them to fit into. They label all of them as like underperforming students, when in reality, like it's like you said, you learn from experience, and that knowledge is just as valid and important as knowledge that you gain from books. And so I actually think that like in our society, there are a lot of people that are incredibly intelligent, but they spend 12 years in a government school being undersold on their abilities, because it's all like, we're going to pass the standardized test. And if your type of knowledge does not conform to our system, then you're not an intelligent person. I just think that whole way of looking at like intelligence and knowledge is like fundamentally wrong, which is why I complain about it at school all the time. I'm sure my coworkers get sick of hearing me say it. It's like every day I'm complaining about that. Like, why are we doing this for the kid? We're not giving them an education.
Yeah.
We're just pushing them down this path that is going to make them hate reading and hate learning when they're older.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that I was diagnosed with ADD, and before it was ADHD. I wasn't hyper. I just couldn't keep my attention on. So they put me on Adderall as a kid and all that good stuff. And I went through that whole process of being like, Mom, I don't like how this makes me feel. I don't feel like that I'm me anymore. And so she let me quit.
Yeah.
And, and like I said, I skated by, and it just wasn't I took vocational classes for like 3 years in electricity. Couldn't be an electrician now, but I took those classes and learned. It's just it's a flawed system. And now with the internet and how much information's out there now, people can they can't get a degree, but they can go out and learn.
Right.
That's the thing with kids nowadays, is if they don't know something, they can go to YouTube, they can just go to online, find someone because there's so much, even courses that are in universities, Harvard and stuff, like there's courses that you can just go on and watch it on video and learn the same thing. You just won't have a piece of paper.
Right.
So, I mean, if you have the will, there is a way nowadays.
Yeah. Well, and that was what really got me into podcasting to begin with. I was in college, and I guess it was probably 2008 or 2009. So right around the time when there were like podcasts that were like, people would start making podcasts like a regular part of their lives. And a lot of universities would release like entire recorded courses on subjects on these podcast streams. Yeah. And so at the time, my day job was that I worked at a dry cleaner, and I'd have to drive a van around for an hour and a half a day. And then I had a long commute from my house to work. And so I would find these courses in areas that I wasn't learning in school. Yeah. And I could listen to these courses on American history or whatever it was. And I learned a lot by doing that. Yeah. And so I think the fact that we have access to more information now than any other human beings that have ever existed on the face of the planet, it's got to shape the way that we approach education at some point. And more people have access to more information and more niche information than ever before. And I think that, again, like from a libertarian perspective, I think it's a great thing, because this is allowing people to have access to information that the corporate press never gave them. Yeah. So people are starting to ask harder questions about, well, why is it that the world runs this? Like, why do we trust these people that have power over us? Which I think is really good. Yeah. And you're obviously very much like me, invested in podcasts. You listen to a lot of podcasts. You have your own podcast. What is the value of podcasting? And then what's the value of Christian podcasting in particular?
Okay. Well, and I think you hit on a lot of it right there, as far as sharing stuff that's not in a book, sharing stuff that's not required to share. You can be yourself, you can share, you can relate to people that normally can't find anyone to relate to. And there's no fear of listening to a podcast. There's no fear of, unless your wife gets really mad at you for listening to Joe Rogan, which, that happens. But, but there... And I think that's the tantalizing thing about it, is you can listen to anything you want. You can download it. You can listen to some comedian from California talking about executions and stuff like that, if you have that little bit of dark humor in your life. But that's so exciting to know that you don't have to worry about what you take into your ears. I know Mom always said garbage in, garbage out. I guess that could be true, but but you can still at the same time take in these courses. You can take in this information. You can pull it all in without having to spend thousands and thousands of dollars, without having to alter your life, really, because it's just that is a little. I feel the downfall of podcasting is that now we are cut off from society. Yeah. In a sense, that is one of the little downfalls, is that you put in headphones. If you go to a gym or anything like that, you put in headphones and no one interacts with each other. Right. So I found myself having to force myself, being in podcasts, listening to a lot of podcasts, to take my headphones out and just have experiences. Like, it gets annoying for Matt or different people like that. He has to work with people in his job constantly, dealing with dum-dums, just doing stupid stuff. So for him, he wants that solace. He wants that quiet. Right. But for me, if we go to the gym and sit in the sauna with other people, I'm like, I don't keep up with sports, up, but I'll be like, hey, what up with those Bengals, huh? Like, just to get a conversation. And so many people are thirsting for that, to have those conversations. Yeah. And that can lead to getting guests on your show, just finding someone who's just like, I've been wanting to talk to someone forever, and me and my wife work different schedules, so I don't get to talk to my wife. We've got a baby, so we're constantly, can't talk to the baby. Right. And some people are just dying for that conversation.
Yeah.
And so listening to podcasts makes you feel like you're a part of that conversation. You can get to where you think you know the host. There's probably people that listen to your show that are just like, oh man, we're close.
Right. Yeah.
We're tight. They would meet you and be like, oh yeah, I heard this about your wife the other day. How's she doing? You're like, I don't know you, man. Like, you need to calm down. And I've had people approach me the same way. But through that, I feel like we can pull people in to get to know other people. Like just having simple conversations, starting it up, people start diarrheaing out the mouth. And it's like, hey, why don't you come over and hang out?
Right.
We'll record a show. You can have an experience if you've never had before. And we'll put your voice out into the interwebs and yada, yada, yada. But yeah, Christian podcasting, though, I feel that it can be good. Like I said, if you don't focus on the numbers, if you don't focus on trying to make money, you can put out love and you can put out a different aspect. Because in my line of church, I feel like so many people are turned away because of Bible thumping. I grew up in a Bible thumping area. My grandpa was a Bible thumper. He had a lot of love, but he still would get out there and be like, you gotta turn. Right. Jehovah's Witness came to the house and he bragged about how he said, well, let's just pray together, and just fell down in his garden in the dirt and just started praying out loud, God, come down. And when he looked up, they were running down the holler to leave the holler. But he always bragged about that. And I was like, why are you bragging about that? Like, no, don't brag about running people off. Like we need to welcome everyone in. And it brought up the story from earlier in my head that we were talking about. I've always wanted to go to like a Jehovah's Witness church or the Mormon church. I see the buildings in our area, and I'm just like, I want to go there once, because I've always had stories of, I guess this is going back to the earlier part of the episode, but I always had stories of people being like, well, this is a cult. This is what they think, and so don't do that.
Right.
I'm like, okay, yeah, you got it. But now I'm like, I just want to drop in on a service on a Saturday or whatever day they meet, and I've even had people just be like, you can't do that. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, they might win you over. Like, dude, they're not going to win me over.
No. You're just curious about what they believe.
Yeah. I want to see what's in that building that doesn't have windows.
Yeah. Right. That's been one of the great things about like podcasting for me too, is that so I follow a lot of progressive Christians on Twitter. I'm not a progressive Christian myself, but I'm interested in that worldview and why they think the way that they do. And so it's been great to like listen to a couple of the podcasts that they put out just to get their perspective, just try to understand like where they're coming from and why they hold their beliefs. And I disagree with that way of looking at Christianity more now than I did before, but I feel like I understand it better and can be more empathetic towards people because of that. So having those, and the same thing too, a few years back, I listened to a bunch of like lectures and podcasts that were put out by atheists, because I didn't understand that. I'd read a couple of like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and stuff like that, but I hadn't really dove into that worldview. And it was really enlightening for me, just trying to hear their arguments and hear where they were coming from. And it was great to have access to that information, because 25, 30 years ago, you would have to go to a bookstore. You'd have to buy them. They would have to have a particular book in stock. And you were limited by your geographical area. Like there might be one bookstore and maybe they don't have the book that you were looking for. But now it's like, if you want to know what somebody thinks or what somebody believes, like the information's right out there at your fingertips. You just have to go out there and take it.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to that whole we're just a bunch of babies thing. Like I took cults class in Bible college, of course, and they talked about all these different religions that I've brought up, and I'm just like, we're all just a bunch of babies, though. Like, I know they've got a dum-dum at their church, just like we have at our church. Like, there's that one guy that's just like, I'm just here, like, they're not these big, bad people.
Right.
Like, they're still trying to do good things. They're still trying to, they're not trying to overrun the government. They're not trying to, I don't know. It's just wanting to see the inner workings and be like, okay, where's your dum-dum? Right. I want to know the guy, the guy that's not sold out for it, that's just there because he's like, he finds something good in it. Like, what do you find good in it, man?
Yeah.
Hey, dum-dum, what's going on, you giant baby? Yeah. Like, I don't know. So, yeah, I feel like having those conversations with random people and getting into experiences like that you can pull them into your podcast. And I feel like that's where those discussions can happen, I guess, or that's where those hard-hitting questions can happen. So.
Yeah. Well, so one of the interesting things as we get ready to draw to a close, one of the interesting things about Podbless is that there are 3 guys. I'm assuming you're all still in your 30s. Is that a good guess or?
Yeah, around about. I'll be 40 this April.
Oh, so you're still in your 30s. You're still in your 30s.
I got
right?
a few months.
Yeah. So one of the I guess, and it's a problem from my perspective, but one of the problems that I've identified is I went to youth group with all of these kids when I was in high school, and I think that of the people that were actively involved in our youth group, there are only like 3 of us that are still involved in church, and a lot of them, they might still consider themselves. Some of them don't consider themselves Christians anymore. Some of them do, but they're not plugged in or involved at all. So for you, there are 3 guys on Podbless. You guys are all in your 30s. You've stuck with the church. You're still participating. So what motivates you to stay connected to the church, and why do you think it's so important for people to do that?
Well, like I said, me being a little bit of a ne'er-do-well, I lean on the fact that God spoke to me a long time ago. And in my heart, I know He's real. Despite all the rules and regulations and all that different stuff, I don't do all the volunteering I want to do. I still like to volunteer with our church, with our food pantry. That's something I do believe in pretty hard. And even if I'm helping just get people through the parking lot, I feel like I'm doing something that's important. Despite any kind of politics that goes through all that stuff. I lost train of thought.
But just being involved and staying active and helping people. Yeah.
And like I said, for Joey, he's a pastor, so that's where he stays involved. And Brett, his wife's a minister, so he stays involved that way. But I do feel that we just see the greater good in it, as far as trying to lead people to Christ. I mean, you can view different things of heaven, you can view different things of hell, and you can even be a Bible thumper. But I feel just doing good. Trying to make life a little more easier for all the people in it, because we have people that are very well off. I mean, I married a doctor. I've got a lot of woes that went away when I married a doctor. They say money won't buy you happiness, but it'll buy you a jet ski. You know what I mean?
Right,
like,
which will make you happy.
And everybody smiles. It's on a jet ski unless you fall off. But so it's fun to see people that are in struggles that you can actually do something to better. And I feel like even though the church can have its hiccups and it can have its problems, I don't ever want to be a part of a church that doesn't outreach.
Right.
When I was a youth minister, we started up a bus program. Some other people had been doing it, but they were only getting 5 or 6 kids. And then all of a sudden I show up and we're starting to do this stuff. I start working with some other people and they're like, we can get a couple more vans. We had 3 vans.
Yeah, that's cool.
15 passenger vans going out through the backwoods of Kentucky, just pulling kids on Wednesday nights. And we would just have droves of kids. And some of them would get touched. Some of them ended up committing crimes and going to jail. Right, yeah. But it was the outreach of letting people know that there is hope outside of their world. Yeah. Because we would bring in a lot of kids that were just in drug homes whose parents would do things to them that we could never imagine. They're just unfathomable for a parent to treat their kid this way or something. Yeah, and so I feel like that's what keeps me involved, is knowing that we can help people, that we can bring some hope or joy into their life. Joy is more my big thing, but just hope in general, that there is something better than what we're facing. And I think that gets into the whole mental health of things nowadays. I've gotten to know a lot of people that deal with heavy depression, and that's been my big challenge lately, is psychology. Yeah. Not I've always thought of myself as I should go into psychology, but like I said, the book learning part, right, it's not so much. So I always do try to find people that are dealing with mental instability. And as far as ministry goes, that's felt like my ministry, as talking with people. I've even had people on Welldagum that have been dealing with things that have really shook me up. Yeah. And so, but yeah, I feel like having that background of church and having that background of wanting to minister to people, but changing it to something as far as like, come to my church, but turning it into, who are you? Right. How are you? What can I do to help you? Yeah. Not what can my church do to help you, but what can I do to help you? Because I've been blessed. I want to bless you. Yada yada yada.
Yeah. That's a great answer. So, what are your podcasting plans for the future?
Get famous, man.
Yeah, everyone wants to get famous. Man, you and me, we're going to be the next Joe Rogans.
There you go.
Joe Rogan 2 and Joe Rogan 3.
There you go. Going to start getting in deprivation tanks and eating mushrooms and all that good stuff. But I don't know. I guess I've never really wanted to be super famous. That was the get-go from the start, or the start from the get-go. It was just sharing. So I feel like just keeping on sharing fun stuff with Podbless. it's a fun thing. I feel like that a lot of youth ministers or a lot of youth ministers or just preachers and stuff. We have a lot of preachers that comment in on a live. We do a live every Thursday night. So, I mean, we'll have a few hundred people just commenting in constantly, saying funny things that they want to get off their chest, never getting too in-depth, but every once in a while we'll have some in-depth stuff. But just, I feel like it can grow and give some people some laughter, bring some people some joy,
Yeah.
So.
And it does. A lot of the podcasts I listen to are either like political, like libertarian political podcast and then biblical studies podcast. And the problem with the political podcast is that they're almost always very depressing. And the problem with the biblical studies podcast is they're almost always very dry. So Podbless is kind of like it's a nice refreshing listen if you want something that's going to make you feel good. And,
we'll have to have you on sometime and let us get deep.
All right, I would love to do that. That'd be a lot of fun. That'd be a lot of fun.
You can bring us to a new level we've not made it to yet.
Yeah, well, and then it's like we were saying, always good to have different voices, right? So I would love to come on to that sometimes.
Yeah,
That'd be great, man.
We will have you.
That'd be great. Well, before you tell everyone where they can find your shows and all of that stuff, how do you find the time to do this with 3 kids? How does your wife? How has your wife been gracious enough to you to give you the time to do this with 3 kids?
Well, like I said, I am a stay-at-home dad. We have 3 under 6. One is 1-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old, and they're all getting ready to have birthdays. But yeah, it's her thing that she gives me for mental health. Yeah. One day a week I go and hang out with the guys, but it's usually around bedtime. So her mom will help out a lot and come over and help put them to bed. But even with today, like we had a lot of stuff going on today and I was like, hey, I'm going to go do a podcast. And she was like, okay. Yeah, this awesome. Is my passion project that anytime I bring it up, she tries not to be too harsh or mean. Even if I'm on a podcast like the Kentucky Hot Brown Boys, they're no longer a podcast, but all their backlogs are still there here in Independence, Kentucky. And she was okay with that because they were lewd, crude dudes covered in tattoos, neck tattoos, all this different stuff. But she was like, yeah, go follow that passion. It's her being supportive of a passion that I found that I've been doing for 3 years, 4 years, something. I don't even know how long now.
Yeah, that's awesome. So where can people find your stuff?
So you can find it anywhere on social medias. Welldagum is on all the listening platforms. I never did video with them or with that product. So if you go to Facebook, you can look Welldagum, all one word, WELLDAGUM. You can go to Facebook, you can go to Twitter, you can go to Instagram, and you'll find something about those there. But you can listen to any Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google. I don't even know if Google Podcasts is a thing anymore. But it's on all of them. They spread out. They're out there for Welldagum. Bunch of backlogs, 100 and some episodes. Really fun. Check it out. Podbless. Every Thursday night we go live on Facebook and YouTube. And you can comment in with us. You can chat in with us, and we'll talk about your comments, and we'll just have a good time. It's about an hour long on a Thursday night. It's kind of late, 9:30-ish, but you can still watch it later. You don't have to watch it live. And you can find that on audio anywhere as well. You can find it Spotify, Apple, anywhere you basically listen to a podcast, you can pretty much find the stuff that we put out. So
yeah, perfect. Well, I will put links to everything in the show notes for you guys that want to check it out at home. Josh, it's been a great conversation, man. Thanks for coming over today.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It was great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.